Galen Auer, okay, from Arise. If you can just state your name again so people will understand it, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
So my name is Galen Auer, and I'm here representing Arise, which is the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education. I also happen to be one of the people who worked on the 2020 Census Campaign, the community-driven campaign to actually make sure that as many people got counted as possible, particularly in what are called the hard-to-count communities, particularly racial minorities and other groups that are frequently or traditionally undercounted in the census. And the reason I'm telling you this, I was hoping that a couple of things. I could respond to a couple of the questions that were raised, and also talk a little bit about some concerns that we at Arise have from our perspective about this process, or things that we hope that you'll take into account as you go through this process. So first, just the South Kingstown question. I'm not a data scientist, so I don't want to presume to know the entire answer, but one thing I can tell you is that the way that the Census Bureau counts on-campus students is different than the way they count off-campus students. They actually count on-campus students by simply requesting a list of the residents on campus from the university. So those students would have been counted accurately, regardless of whether they were on campus or not, whereas off-campus students wouldn't have been, because they would have been counted through the normal process of the Census Bureau going and knocking on their door. That's probably part of the reason. I don't know if it's the entire reason. But so there's lots of little operational things like that I think could have influenced the data in some ways, especially considering COVID and how it impacted that entire process last year. Another thing that I wanted to just mention quickly is this notion of like the 100% of the population as the starting point, which of course makes sense from a from a practical standpoint, but I just want to clarify that when we talk about that 100%, we're talking about 100% of the people who were counted in the census, which doesn't necessarily actually reflect the number of people living in the state. We know, the Census Bureau knows and frequently talks about the fact that people are undercounted all the time. Again, that's why they're called hard to count communities, people who maybe don't want to answer the door when somebody knocks, or people who for various reasons just get overlooked. People experiencing homelessness is a population that's hugely undercounted frequently in the census. So this is just to say that when we're talking about getting to 100% or making sure it adds up to 100%, it's not actually like literally the number of people. So I think that that's important to remember, because leading into my next point, which is the racial data and how it will be used throughout this redistricting process. So I think we talked a lot about race, sort of went a little more quickly through the issue of the ethnicity question and Hispanic and not Hispanic. I just wanted to really lift that up, because someone isn't less Black because they're also Hispanic, right? And so people's identities are intersectional, and their experiences are intersectional. And so I just want to make sure that the Commission is aware of this and thinking about this as you look at the different data sets that Mr. Brace has provided, because I really think that taking people out of all the other race categories and simply counting them as Hispanic is not reflective of their actual experiences or identities, which is why actually the Census Bureau started added that fill in the blank. Unfortunately, we're not going to have that data, all the fill in the blank data, but specifically around this some other race category, and why you saw that drop so dramatically when you took out people who identified as Hispanic. One big reason for that is because we found here in Rhode Island, but also the national, I'm going to mess it up, NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, I believe, found nationwide that people who identify as Latino or Hispanic would frequently check off some other race and then fill in Latino or Hispanic under race. So that's one reason why so many people who identify as Hispanic fall into that some other race category. It's because they're actually confused by the fact that they're two different questions. And this was something we encountered with individuals when we were doing outreach, was realizing like, oh, there were so many questions, like why are they two different questions? Why isn't it just part of the same question? And so organizations like NALEO have actually recommended that in the future, the Census Bureau don't have two separate questions because it is confusing, and there are many Hispanic and Latino folks who identify as Hispano and or Latino as their race as well as their ethnicity. I swear I'm not going to take forever. Similarly, just very quickly on the broad racial categories, obviously being the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education, the Asian category is one that we're paying very close attention to, and it's definitely of some concern that this is just sort of a big catch-all category for anyone who identifies as Asian. That includes categories like Chinese, Filipino, Asian, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, or other Asian, which in reality, these are distinct groups of people who often experience dramatically different socioeconomic status, educational outcomes, and immigrant experiences. I would be happy to get some actual data to back that up for you if you're interested. But just anecdotally, you know, a Chinese foreign student who's studying at Brown University and lives on the east side is not going to have the same exact experience as a Vietnamese refugee family that's living on the south side. So just sort of lumping all those people into one category just raises those questions about whether that's really serving those people in the best way possible. And I don't necessarily know what the solution is, because again, I know we don't have all that fill in the blank data, but again, just something I wanted to lift up as you're going through this process. All right, I'm almost done. Last thing, which is just when I was part of the 2020 census campaign effort, one thing I would always start with when I did trainings with people about how to outreach about the census was to start with history, the history of the census, and the fact that when it was first founded, there was actually a debate about how to count people of color, specifically how to count enslaved Black African Americans at the time. And that's what's famously known as the 3/5 Compromise. And it was determined that for the purposes of the census, in fact, it's in the Constitution, Section 1, Article 2, or Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, it says, it will be decided by the count of all free persons